Students, welcome to my class on Introduction of Mycology. In today's class, I will be giving you a very brief overview of the way in which fungi are classified and also a very brief overview on the different types of infections that it causes and the techniques that we employ in a mycology laboratory to identify and diagnose these fungal infections. Mycology has originated from the term myx, which means mushroom. It is basically a study of the epidemiology, the ecology, pathogenesis, diagnosis, and the treatment modalities of fungal infections in human beings. Basically, fungi are widely distributed in nature. That is what we need to understand upfront. Now, if you roughly take a guess of how many fungi are present, you will know that there are more than 1.5 uh, crores of fungi which are usually present. And out of this innumerable number of fungi which are distributed widely in nature, 70,000 of them have been clearly documented with their morphological forms and the diagnostic techniques. Out of the 70,000 fungal species, 400 of them are usually known to cause human infections. Out of these 400 fungal species known to cause human infections, 100 of them are commonly seen in our routine clinical practice. And out of these 100 fungi, 50 fungi are noted with increasing frequency among the patients that usually come to our hospital settings. Now, if I have to summarize this entire class in one word, that would be to define the fungi. Now, if you look at the definition of fungi, this is an apt definition, not because uh, it is a lengthy one, but because it covers the different aspects of fungi. So, if you can see, we usually define fungi as achlorophyllous, that means it doesn't contain chlorophyll. Eukaryotic, so it contains all the cellular organelles. Heterotrophic, depending on the different sources for sunlight and energy. Unicellular or multicellular organism which have a wide growth requirement. They can be facultatively anaerobic or strictly aerobic and multiply sexually and asexually and exist as saprotrophs in the environment and also in the dead and decaying organic debris. Commensals, they form a part of our normal flora, or parasites causing a range of infections from superficial, subcutaneous, deep, and disseminated infections. So, this in a nutshell covers the entire spectrum of the characteristics of a fungi. So, I will repeat the definition once again. Fungi are achlorophyllous, eukaryotic, heterotrophic, unicellular or multicellular organisms which are facultatively anaerobic or strictly aerobic and multiply sexually and asexually, existing as saprotrophs, commensals, or parasites, causing superficial, subcutaneous, deep, and disseminated infections. Now, if you look at the discovery pyramid of microorganisms, you will notice that out of all the different type of microbes that we know, the viruses, parasites, bacteria, and fungi, the latest or the last to be discovered are the viruses in the year 1892. Before viruses, We knew bacteria in the year 1676 thanks to Anton van Leeuwenhoek's microscope. Prior to the bacteria, the incidence of parasitic infections were detected in the Ebers Papyrus in Egypt, and even prior to the parasites which were detected in 1500 BC, fungi were known to be a part of 2.4 billion year old fossils in South Africa. So, the point that I'm trying to make here is fungi are the oldest of all the different microbes that are usually present. But when we come to clinical practice, when usually we are asked about the probable infectious causes of one condition in our clinical practice, we generally start with bacterial, viral, parasitic, and then only come to the fungal infections. Probably this is the reason why the epidemiology of fungal infections have not been studied well. Probably this is also the reason why fungal infections have been underdiagnosed in clinical practice. So, this particular juncture, I would like to tell all of you that whenever we encounter an infectious person or a patient with an infectious etiology, we should always have a very broad mind to include bacteria, virus, parasites, and fungi in equal measures. Okay, the priority should be equal. You should not look for a fungal infection after you have ruled out bacterial, viral, and parasitic infections. So, all of them, the fungal infections should be on par with the other microbial infections. So, such a high index of suspicion will usually enable you to pick up the fungal infections quite early, and if it is diagnosed and treated early, the patients recover quite early, and you will also become a very good clinician if you are able to pick up such infections. And I personally believe that there is a huge pool of undetected cases of fungal infections in India. Now, whenever we talk of the identification of fungi, we usually uh, quote John Rippon, who usually remarks that the identification of fungi is often like the problem of being able to recognize your own grandmother among the residents of a nursing home for the elderly. You can pick her out in a crowd, but no one else can, even when given her description. Now, my friends, this is because we are not aware of the lingo or the language that is used to describe the fungi. One thing that we always should remember is, unlike all the other microbes, where the variation is much more lesser, the fungi or the variations in a fungal isolate is quite frequent. So the only constant in mycology is variation. And with the rapid advancement of the diagnostic techniques, especially the molecular diagnostic tools, the fungal classification has been altered very frequently, and even the names of the fungi have changed. So, if you consider the basic differences between a fungi and the bacteria, one thing which stands out is that fungi are primarily eukaryotic. Okay, and the second thing that we all should remember is that fungi contains ergosterol, which is not present in the bacteria. Another thing is the cell wall of the fungi usually is composed of chitin, glucan, and mannan. Now, why am I emphasizing about the ergosterol and the chitin, glucan, and mannan is that most of our antifungals which are currently available to treat these infections target the ergosterol and the glucan pathway synthesis. And also, some of the serological tests of the fungal for fungi usually employ antibodies directed against glucan and mannan. So therefore it is very vital for us to remember these three differences. So this is the reason why I told that we need to remember about these cellular components. If you look at the azole group of antifungals which are widely used to treat the fungal infection, they primarily inhibit the ergosterol biosynthesis pathway. Now another class of antibiotics, that is your polyenes. Okay, even the polyenes primarily act on the ergosterol uh, pathway and disrupts the membrane integrity. So your common polyene that is used is amphotericin B, which is usually employed for the detection of the fungal for treatment of fungal infections in the immunocompromised patients. And the newer drugs like your echinocandins, caspofungin, micafungin, and anidulafungin inhibit the glucan synthesis. And there are also other drugs like flucytosine, which inhibits nucleic acid synthesis. So your frontline antifungal drugs, your azoles, candins, and amphotericin B, primarily act on ergosterol and glucan biosynthesis pathways. So the other differences are that fungi can reproduce both sexually and asexually. If you do a gram staining on the fungi, usually they are gram positive and they are non-acid fast, and we employ the histochemical stains or histopathological stains like periodic acid Schiff stain and Gomori methenamine silver stain to also detect the fungal hyphae, especially in the tissues. So, as I told you, my friends, when I studied MBBS, I usually was taught that fungi usually cause infections only in the immunocompromised. Now, in the year 2020, we have noted certain drastic changes in the epidemiological determinants in causing fungal infections. The mere presence of an indwelling device and the increased environmental spore burden itself is a high risk factor for a fungal infection even in immunocompetent host. So that's what I would like to highlight. Most of the fungal infections are now seen in immunocompetent individuals. In our own mycology laboratory, we have noticed that over the past 3 to 4 years, more and more fungal infections have been detected among the age group of 40 to 60 years rather than greater than 60 years of age patient population. So we have an increasing number of fungal infections seen in immunocompetent individuals and seen in the most economically productive age group population. Also, mere admission to the intensive care unit along with other comorbidities like kidney diseases and liver diseases and lung diseases along with diabetes mellitus is also another very important risk factor for fungal infection. Definitely, climate change has played a major role in the increased incidence of fungal infections. We earlier speak of yeast growing at 37 degrees Celsius and molds growing at 28 degrees Celsius whenever we talk of fungal infections. But now we are also seeing that some of the molds grow at 37 degrees Celsius. So the climatic changes have enabled these fungi to adapt itself to the variations and cause infections. more and more fungal infections are seen among economically deprived patients who do not have enough resources or money to get treated, and therefore they go towards quacks who employ unscientific methods. Definitely, abuse and misuse of antibiotics and steroids have led to an alarming rate of fungal infections among the common population. So, what these antibiotics do or the steroids do is they interfere with the immunoregulatory and immunomodulatory functions in our host, and they destroy the resident microbial flora in the humans. So, this will predispose the causation of fungal infections, especially the commensal fungal infections. And as of today, there is no one hospital in in our Indian subcontinent where the construction activities don't take place. So every construction activity in the hospital is associated with generation of lot of dust and other particles which contain lot of these fungal spores in the environment. So your spore burden in the environment is drastically increased. So therefore, before proceeding to construct the or renovate the hospital premises, it is always worthwhile to consider the type of patients uh, who are present in that particular area of hospital where you would like to do these construction activities, and you would like to isolate them or shift them from these constructive activities so that they are at lesser risk of the inhalation of the environmental spores which are generated due to the rampant hospital construction activities. So now we come to the different cell wall components of the fungi. This picture or this diagram is of the negative staining or the Indiaing staining of uh, yeast, which is called as Cryptococcus neoformans. So the halo that you are seeing against a dark background represents the capsule of the fungi. Now, capsule of a fungi is usually made of extracellular polysaccharide. It is a determinant of virulence and elicits the host immune response. Again, presence of capsule is one of the basis of certain diagnostic tests. Then we come to the next important cellular organelle. As I told you, we have your chitin, glucan, and mannan, which basically maintains shape and protects the fungi from the adverse effects of the environment. The cell wall is also responsible for providing nutrition to the fungi, and the antibodies directed against these cell wall components are employed in the serological test and are also the sites of action of the antifungal drugs. So the other organelles present in the fungi, I will just quickly mention because you all know that fungi are eukaryotic and you know the various cellular organelles. So here we have the nucleus, which contains or which is limited by the nuclear membrane. Then the chromosomes present inside the nucleus. We have the plasma membrane delimiting the cytoplasm from the cell wall. Then we have the cytoplasm with its various organelles like the Golgi apparatus and the mitochondria. So all of these cellular organelles are present in the fungi because fungi are eukaryotic in nature. Now, one of the basic essential points that you need to consider or remember whenever we talk about fungi is the different structures which are present in the fungi. Fungal hyphae are the preliminary structures which are present in the fungi. So the fungi consist of simpler units or basic structures called as hyphae, and these hyphae are filamentous structures composed of chitin. They are multinucleate and they usually grow at the tips. So, the presence of the hyphae enables fungi to establish itself into the host, and using this hyphae, the fungi invades into the different tissues and gathers nutrition from the surroundings. Based on the presence or absence of the septa, the hyphae are classified into a septate hyphae and a non-septate hyphae. We also have several shapes described with the hyphae. They are usually described as racket hyphae, nodular hyphae, spiral hyphae, or root-like hyphae, depending on the different fungal species. Now, usually racket, nodular, and spiral hyphae are associated with a group of fungi which are called as dermatophytes, which primarily cause infections of the keratinized tissues of the body, like your hair, skin, and nail. Whereas rhizoids, as you all must be aware from your biology classes, is usually a very important hyphal structure or a component of fungi such as Rhizopus and Mucor, which usually contaminates the foodstuff. Both Rhizopus and Mucor also belong to a very important class of fungi called as zygomycetes, about which we will be seeing later. So these individual units are called as hyphae, and when you have a group of hyphae, we call it as a mycelium. So this is what is called as the mycelium, and you would have noticed the mycelium usually seen contaminating the foodstuff, okay, your old foodstuff, and also you might be seeing this mycelium in certain old furniture, okay, in old books, old furniture, or during the rainy season, especially in the clothes, in the wet clothes, you might be seeing some mycelium like this. So this is a septate hyphae because of the presence of the characteristic septa, and this is aseptate or non-septate hyphae because if you see the entire structure, there are no septa. Okay, the aseptate hyphae are also called as coenocytic hyphae. Okay, COENOCYTIC, coenocytic hyphae. Now we come to the fungal spores. Now, unlike bacterial spores, which are usually formed under adverse environmental conditions, fungal spores are usually formed as a result of a reproduction taking place in the fungi. Now, when there is a sexual reproduction taking place, we usually have different sexual spores depending on the class of the fungi, whereas whenever asexual reproduction takes place, we call the spores as conidia. So please remember, when we say spores, we mean that these are the propagules of sexual reproduction of fungi, and when we say conidia, we mean that they are the propagules of asexual reproduction of the fungi. Now your conidia, depending on the size, you can further identify it as a microconidia or a macroconidia. Micro means small and macro means large. So what you are seeing here are the spores, okay, the different spores which are released from the fruiting bodies here, okay, which are called as phyalids. These spores are released in chains. So this is the spore of a fungi called as penicillium, and now penicillium has been renamed as Talaromyces. So please remember, the genus Penicillium or Penicillium marnefi, which we usually studied in the science classes, has now been renamed as Talaromyces marnafi or Talaromyces species. And what you're seeing here, okay, is of the both the microconidia and macroconidia of a common fungal species which are called as dermatophytes. Okay, so this particular dermatophyte is fungi called as Trichophyton rubrum. Okay, here you can see numerous microconidia, and along with that you can see some pencil shaped macroconidia here. Okay, usually this typical appearance is described as bird on wire appearance. So now we come to the morphological classification of the fungi. Based on their appearances, fungi are morphologically classified into several categories. Now, the first morphological classification is called as the yeast. Now, the yeast are a class of fungi which are usually unicellular in nature. Microscopically, they appear oval to round, and they reproduce by budding. So, usually yeast appear as oval to round cells with budding. Okay, so this is the typical budding which is seen in a yeast cell. So, every yeast cell will undergo this budding and they reproduce by budding. So, this particular cell, the daughter cell which is formed by the budding, is usually formed. This formation usually takes place by utilizing all the layers of the cell present in the parent yeast. So, therefore, this is budding yeast cells are also called as the blastoconidia. Okay, please remember, in some of the textbooks you will find it as blastoconidia. So, don't get confused. Blastoconidia are the budding yeast cells because they employ all the layers of the cell wall of the parent cell. Macroscopically, they resemble bacterial colonies and they are usually pasty in nature. And a common example of the yeast is your Cryptococcus neoformans, which causes meningitis in immunocompromised individuals, especially in HIV positive immunocompromised individuals. However, there are varieties of cryptococci which can also cause infections in immunocompetent individuals. Now, the next class of the microbes is called as the yeast-like group. Now, the yeast-like fungi or the yeast-like group of fungi grow partly as yeast and partly as elongated cells resembling hyphae. So, these are called as pseudohyphae. Now, here I would like to stress upon the differences between a hyphae and a pseudohyphae. Hyphae usually are elongated structures which have parallel walls, and there are no constrictions across the entire length of the hyphae. But if you see a pseudohyphae, as it is shown here, pseudohyphae, the cell walls are not parallel, they are opposed to each other, or they are pinched, and as they grow or as they arise from the parent yeast cell, there is a small constriction in the parent yeast cell, okay, from the parent yeast cell wall. So, the pseudohyphae or the false hyphae, which is usually described in Candida albicans, is nothing but a hyphal structure which has a constriction at the point of origin, whereas a true hyphae will never have this constriction. A common example of yeast-like organism, as I told you, is your commensal fungi, Candida albicans, which is usually seen as your commensal fungi in your oral, respiratory tract and also in the reproductive tract. Now, the next class of fungi are usually described as molds. Now, molds in comparison to yeast, molds are multicellular and they are seen both as hyphae and they also have spores or conidia depending on the type of the reproduction process, and usually they appear pigmented macroscopically. The colonies appear pigmented, so different types of pigments are present in different molds, and sometimes we use this pigmentation characteristics to identify certain species of molds. So if you look at the colony of a mold, the side of the colony that is facing you directly, it is called as the obverse side, and the side of the colony which is facing against you or which is opposite to you is called as the reverse side. So we are using several terms to describe the topography of the colonies, and most of the time you will find descriptions like cottony, woolly, velvety or granular described for molds. So some of the most common molds are dermatophytes and your aspergillus species. So what you're seeing in this diagram is a mold. This is the macroconidia and this is the hyphae, the spiral hyphae. This is the boat shaped macroconidia, and this particular isolate belongs to a fungi, a dermatophytic fungi called Trichophyton mentagrophytes. The next class of the fungi are called as the dimorphic fungi. Now, why they are called dimorphic is because they are capable of existing under different morphological forms depending on the environmental conditions. Usually at 37 degrees Celsius or in vivo or inside the human body, they exist as yeast, and at 25 degrees Celsius in vitro, they exist as molds. Some of the examples of dimorphic fungi are Histoplasma capsulatum, Blastomyces dermatitidis, Coccidioides immitis, Sporothrix schenki. Now, what we need to remember here is that we need to demonstrate the conversion of the yeast form to the mold form whenever we identify the dimorphic fungi. So this particular conversion is demonstration of this conversion is a must to identify the dimorphic fungi. So this is your morphological classification of fungi. Now we slowly move over to the spore based classification of the fungi. So morphologically they are classified as yeast, yeast like, mold and dimorphic. Now based on spore formation, we classify fungi further as Zygomycota, Basidiomycota and Ascomycota. Now Zygomycota are your conjugation fungi, and usually these type of fungi have aseptate hyphae. Okay, the characteristic presence of broad aseptate hyphae is the hallmark of the Zygomycetes fungi. As per the current classification, the zygomycetes have been renamed as Glomerulomycota. Okay, I will repeat once again. The current classification, as per the current classification, zygomycetes have been renamed as Glomerulomycota. Now, zygomycetes classically produce zygospores in the sexual stage, and in the asexual stage, the sac called as sporangium contains numerous sporangiospores. So the sexual spores are zygospores and the asexual spores are sporangiospores present within a sac called as sporangia. The two hallmark characteristics of any zygomycetes infection is that number one, they are very rapidly angio-invasive. That means they invade the blood vessels so fast that if at all there is a fungal emergency, it is because of the zygomycetes which cause the fungal infection. So any suspected zygomycete infections, we quickly go for the surgical debridement, or in some cases surgical amputation of the affected part, to prevent these fungi from rapidly invading to the other parts of the body. The second hallmark is usually the zygomycetes fungi cause infections in the diabetic patients. Okay, that is because the diabetic patients, especially those who are in the stage of diabetic ketoacidosis, have high level of ketone bodies in their system. So these zygomycetes fungi utilize the ketone reductase system to uh, or to metabolize these ketone bodies and utilize the ketone bodies for their growth and reproduction and metabolism and further invasion. So these are the two hallmarks of the zygomycetes fungi. Now if you ask me who are the members, I've already mentioned they are your Rhizopus, Mucor, and commonly they are seen contaminating your foodstuffs, especially if you keep some foodstuffs for a long time in the fridge. You will notice that some of the foodstuffs are usually contaminated by the zygomycetes fungi. But having said that, please also remember that sometimes even Aspergillus or Penicillium species can also contaminate these foodstuffs. So then we have your Ascomycota. As I mentioned about Aspergillus previously, now Ascomycota, Aspergillus is the classical example of the Ascomycetes fungi. In comparison to the Zygomycetes fungi, the Ascomycota have a septate hyphae. So that is the basic difference structurally. So Zygomycota have broad aseptate hyphae. Sometimes some of the zygomycetes also have sparsely septate hyphae. So but the proportion of both this presence or absence of the septa is relatively variable. So generally they have more number of aseptate hyphae than the septate hyphae. Whereas in contrast to your zygomycetes, your ascomycetes usually have septate hyphae. They are described as cup fungi. The sexual spores are called as ascospores, usually present within a sac or ascus, and the asexual spores usually are seen at the tip of the hyphae. So classical example of the ascospores are shown in this particular diagram, and this is the cluster of these are the ascospores which are usually seen in Aspergillus species. Now the next class of fungi is called as the Basidiomycota. The Basidiomycota are also called as the club fungi. Again, like the Ascomycetes, they have septate hyphae, but what is different here is the sexual spores. Now if you look at this diagram, just notice this particular, focus on this particular area. Now this particular structure or the fruiting body here, it is called as the basidium. So from the tip of the basidium, you have different spores which are coming out from this group of fungi, and these spores are called as the basidiospores. And please remember, asexual spores are not common. These basidiospores or the basidiomycetes are usually seen to decompose the wood. And whenever we describe of fungi, we say that their fungi has got two forms. One is called as the sexual form and another one is called as the asexual form. My friends, please remember, the sexual forms are also called as the teleomorph. Okay, sexual form is also called as the teleomorph, and the asexual form is called as the anamorph. ANAMORPH. So asexual form is called as the anamorph and the sexual form is called as the teleomorph. Easy to remember, anatomical morphology, that is your anamorph, that is your asexual form, and the sexual form is called as the teleomorph. So Cryptococcus species is one of the important examples of the Basidiomycetes fungi. Now Cryptococcus exists as the asexual form in the yeast phase. It is called Cryptococcus neoformans, and in the sexual stage the name is called for Cryptococcus is Phylobasidiella neoformans. Okay, so that's why I specifically mentioned that sexual form of Cryptococcus species is a better example of a Basidiomycetes fungi. So now we have finished the spore classification of the fungi. So we have learnt till now the morphological and spore classification of the fungi. Now we come to the clinical classification, one that is most important to us as doctors. So clinically, fungi are classified as causing superficial and deep infections. Now the deep infections or the deep mycosis is further subclassified as subcutaneous mycosis and systemic mycosis. Now let us see each of these different classes in a very brief overview. So superficial mycosis are further subclassified as surface infections and the skin infections or the cutaneous infections. Now the common surface infections are Tinea versicolor, Tinea nigra and Pedra, and your cutaneous infections, the major chunk of them being caused by your dermatophytes, which are also called as the skin plants. Okay, derma, skin, phytes, plants. Now one thing which is the hallmark of superficial fungal infections, students, please remember this, is that superficial mycosis usually elicit a negligible immune response. Okay, they do not cause immune response, and that is why most of the patients with superficial fungal infection usually approach the outpatient department due to cosmetic reasons. So the fungal lesions are usually in the form of a nodule or a macule or a pigment or some discoloration or some scaling, or some of the skin changes are only seen. So because it does not elicit immune response, they are not that much symptomatic, and most of the time this group of patients usually approach for cosmetic problems. And if they come to the doctors, it is well and good, but unfortunately there are a class of people who go to the cosmetology clinics, and the cosmetologists who are there in such clinics, and if they are not qualified doctors, they usually do some chemical treatments, laser or some peeling or something like that, not knowing that it is a fungal infection, and they further exacerbate or aggravate the pre-existing skin lesions. Okay, so that is a practical point of superficial fungal infections. Then we have the subcutaneous fungal infections. Now the usual subcutaneous fungal infections are your mycetoma, sporotrichosis and rhinosporidiosis. So the hallmark for subcutaneous fungal infection is that all of these infections follow a trivial trauma. It might be a small pinprick, it might be a small thorn prick, okay, or it may be a small laceration or abrasion that you might have developed. So this will progress to form a subcutaneous fungal infection. So always there will be a history of a small trivial trauma from all these patients. Okay, so that is the hallmark of subcutaneous fungal infections. Then we come to the systemic fungal infections. Usually these systemic fungal infections are caused by the dimorphic fungi. So most of the dimorphic fungi capable of existing both in yeast and mold forms cause the systemic fungal infection. Now, another hallmark or one hallmark of systemic fungal infections is that usually these fungal infections are have two sites of infection. You have a primary site of fungal infection, and this primary site will usually be the lungs, because most of these systemic fungal diseases are acquired by inhalation of these fungal spores, and from that primary site they go and invade the secondary sites via the lymphatics or via the bloodstream. So this is a basic hallmark of the systemic fungal infections. Then we also have a group of opportunistic fungal infection. As the name itself suggests, that whenever there is a compromise in our immune response, or whenever our immune system is subjected to different treatments or long-term use of steroids, or even anti-cancer therapy, or whenever there is a malignancy, or in cases of uncontrolled diabetes, or in HIV infections, there is an immunocompromised status in the host, we usually have some of the fungal infections which are seen commonly, and they are your Candida, your Aspergillus, and also Penicillium, which now again is called as Talaromyces. So hereafter I will be you will be reading, or you will be learning about Penicillium infections as Talaromyces infections in the future. So please keep this change in mind. And also you have the mucormycosis, which is a component of the zygomycotic infections caused by Mucor and Rhizopus species. So now we progress to the lab diagnosis of the fungal infections. Now, first and foremost, for an effective lab diagnosis of fungal infection, you should have a high clinical index of suspicion. So whenever you encounter a patient with infectious diseases, always please have a very high index of suspicion for the fungal infections. Okay, only then you will be able to identify them. So once you have thought of fungal infections as one of your infectious etiology, now you have to examine the patient, and on a case to case basis you have to decide whether it classifies, or whether the features, the signs and symptoms classify or fall under the superficial mycosis, subcutaneous mycosis, or systemic mycosis. So if it is a superficial mycosis, we usually prefer skin scales, and skin, hair and nails samples. And so for subcutaneous mycosis, we prefer aspirates of pus and scrapings or crust from the subcutaneous tissues. And for systemic mycosis, depending on the organ system involved, we collect the appropriate samples. Now once we collect these samples, they are usually subjected to the microscopic examination. Now usually we if the tissues are, or if the specimens are your skin, nail and hair specimens, or tissue specimens, or in case of mucous membrane swabs, respiratory specimens, or certain vaginal swabs, we usually employ what is called as the wet mount or the potassium hydroxide mount. Now the basic principle of this wet mount is that potassium hydroxide, which is used in a concentration of about 10 to 30% weight by volume, dissolves tissue cells and other keratinized material, making the fungal elements more visible. Now higher concentration of cellular chitin will make the fungal elements more resistant to the denaturation effects of potassium hydroxide. So to speed up the process of this KOH mount, we usually add Another component called as DMSO or dimethyl sulfoxide, which will increase the process of visualization of the fungal elements in especially in the absence of heat. So this is the usual technique that we employ as a frontline investigation in most of the mycology labs. So what you're seeing here is the fungal hyphae which are present in this specimen from the as a part of the KOH mount. Then we also go for gram staining. Please remember, gram staining is usually employed more for yeast and yeast-like organisms. We do not employ gram stain for the molds. So for Candida and Cryptococcus, we will employ gram stain, and here in this picture you can see the gram stain picture of Candida albicans, where you can note the Candida albicans has a gram positive oval budding yeast cells with pseudohyphae. Then we from the culture, okay, so we inoculate the samples in the culture medium. I will be talking to you about it in the next few slides. So from the culture plates, when the molds grow, we usually take the colonies of these molds and subject it to what we call as the lactophenol cotton blue mount preparation. Okay, so just like your gram stain for your bacteria, the frontline the microscopic investigation or the microscopic technique for identification of the mold is the lactophenol cotton blue mount preparation, or the LPCB. Now lactic acid in this LPCB acts as the clearing agent and it preserves the fungal morphology. Phenol acts as a disinfectant and cotton blue stains the outer wall of the fungus. So this is your lactophenol cotton blue mount. And usually when we see the LPCB mount directly from the colonies which are growing on the agar, the colonies are not very clearly visualized. Okay, the microscopic structures are not very clearly visualized. So in such situations, we do what is called as the slide culture. So we pick up these colonies and we place these colonies on agar blocks of Sabrot's dextrose agar, which is the frontline culture media used for the diagnosis of fungal infections. So under the Sabrot's dextrose agar blocks, we place a cover slip over it, and then we allow the entire preparation to incubate in room temperature in a Petri plate. And after around 24 hours, we will take the colony and examine by putting a drop of the LPCB or the lactophenol cotton blue reagent on the colony to visualize the complete morphological structure of the fungi, which is undisturbed. So this will enable us to identify these molds better. And we also use another fluorochrome or the fluorescent staining, which is called as the chalcofluor white staining. Now the chalcofluor white is usually binds to the beta 1,3 and beta 1,4 polysaccharides like your cellulose and chitin, which is present in the fungal cell wall, and this will fluoresce when exposed to the ultraviolet light. So usually we use a fluorescent microscopy for the chalcofluor white staining. Especially it is useful for the direct microscopic examination of specimens because the fungal elements are seen in much more easily because they will fluoresce in comparison to the traditional KOH mount. But having said that, in those labs which do not have fluorescent microscope, KOH mount is still employed. But in comparison to your, because both the staining techniques, your KOH mount and the chalcofluor white staining, both of them require equal amount of expertise to rule out the other artifacts or other elements. And if we do a KOH mounting, we usually see the fungal elements as bright apple green structures on a red background. Okay, and this particular technique, the chalcofluor white technique, is also very useful for detecting the fungal elements directly from the samples. Now, there are certain tissue stains which are also used. One point I would like to highlight here is diagnosing a fungal infection requires four group of doctors. So you require a clinician who's having a high index of suspicion. Then you require a mycologist for doing a culture, of course, and then you require a pathologist to demonstrate the presence of these hyphal elements in the tissue, and also you require a radiologist to note if there are any characteristic changes in the tissues radiologically. So all these four group of people are required for successfully diagnosing a fungal infection. Now, several histological stains or histopathological stains are used for identifying the fungal infections. One thing is that under histology, we cannot accurately identify the species. We can only say that it is a hyphal fragment is seen, whether it is septate or aseptate, whether it is an acute angle branching hyphae, or whether it is a broad aseptate hyphae. Okay, so only these general and broad characteristics can be found out, more than the species. So for an accurate species level identification, fungal culture is always the gold standard. So if you have a suspected fungal case and if you are collecting a tissue sample, please remember in your practice that you have to send the same tissue sample, okay, one part of it preserved in formalin for the pathologist for biopsy, and other part of it in saline. Please remember, whenever you send the tissue samples for fungal culture, you always immerse it in a sterile saline, and you have to send the sample to the mycology lab. So both these pathology and the mycology lab, you have to send the tissue samples if you suspect a subcutaneous or a systemic infection. So your diagnostic accuracy will be enhanced. Now, having said that, there are some merits and some demerits of each of these stains. Now, your H&E stain, you will see the fungi as pink to purple blue. The advantage is you can demonstrate tissue response, you can visualize pigmented fungi, and you can stain the nuclei of some yeast-like fungi. But the disadvantage is it is very difficult to visualize many fungal elements, and sometimes these fungal elements might be overlooked because it resembles your normal cells. Then you have your GMS stain. GMS stain, classically you can see the fungi as black brown structures on a light green background. Okay, it is an excellent staining technique, no doubt, but sometimes the innate color of certain pigmented fungi may be masked. Okay, so there are some fungi whose hyphae appear dark in color. Okay, and such innate fungi, pigmented fungi, the color will be masked, so we will not know whether it is a darkly pigmented fungi. They belong to altogether a different class of fungi. Okay, so we will not know whether it is a pigmented fungi or it is a hyaline fungi. So therefore that is one small disadvantage. And another thing is it cannot study the host tissue reaction because all the cells will be stained black in color. You will not be able to distinguish the host cells from the fungi, and the RBCs and WBCs which are present in the sample resemble the yeast form, and so also the reticulin and the elastin fibers. But one advantage is, even if there are certain old or non-viable fungi present in the sample, that will also be stained by the GMS stain. Now another staining technique used is the PAS stain. PAS stain will also stain the fungi pink to purple pink, and this will also, like your HND, it will mask the innate color of the pigmented fungi, and it will be very difficult for us to note the tissue reaction. Okay, and it does not stain old and non-viable fungi unlike your GMS stain. And then you have Mayer's Musicamen stain, usually stains pink. It is used to detect the mucopolysaccharide capsule of Cryptococcus neoformans. However, Mayer's Musicamen may also stain Rhinosporidium seaberi, the organism which causes rhinosporidiosis. It is a subcutaneous fungal infection, and also certain cells of Blastomyces dermatitidis, which is a dimorphic fungi causing systemic mycosis. So these are your histopathological stains which are commonly used as a part of the microscopic techniques for diagnosis of fungal infections. Now we come to a very important part, that is the culture of the fungi. The usual culture medium that is used is Sabouraud's dextrose agar. So please remember, most of the culture medium that is employed is or the morphologies of most of these organisms is usually described very well in the Sabouraud's dextrose agar. Okay, in the Sabouraud's dextrose agar, conventionally there are two types of SDA. Okay, there is a conventional medium and there is a Emmons modification. Now, conventionally, the pH of Sabouraud's dextrose agar is acidic in nature. It is about 5.6. But nowadays, we are using the Emmons modification of Sabouraud's dextrose agar. Most of the colonies, in fact, almost all of the colonies of the fungi that have been described so far, have been described on the basis of the growth on the Sabouraud's dextrose agar. So most of the mycologists you no longer consider necessary to use 4% dextrose, which is used in the conventional Sabouraud's dextrose agar. So in the Emmons modification, first change is that the dextrose or the sugar that is used is lesser. It is only 2% in comparison to the conventional where you use 4% of sugar. Second thing is pH is neutral pH. Okay, it is a neutral pH. Conventional it is 5.6, and the newer version or the modified Sabouraud's dextrose agar, the pH is 6.9. Okay, and this neutral pH has been found to be better for some fungi. Okay, and why earlier it was we were using an SDA with acidic pH is because we wanted to suppress the bacterial growth. But nowadays we can do this bacterial growth with the neutral pH itself by inoculating the organisms in Sabouraud's dextrose agar containing certain antibiotics like chloramphenicol and cycloheximide. Okay, chloramphenicol is usually employed to suppress the bacterial contamination. So along with Sabouraud's dextrose agar, we also add antibiotics like chloramphenicol, cycloheximide and gentamicin. Now chloramphenicol is added to suppress the bacterial contaminants. Cycloheximide is added to suppress the saprobic or commensal or saprobic, I would rather say saprobic microbial flora, okay, or saprophytes, uh, saprobic fungi, I should say, or environmental fungi. Um, but if we are then we use gentamicin also to inhibit the bacterial flora. Okay, so these are the commonest antibiotics which are added to inhibit the bacterial flora. Okay, so we use, I'll repeat, chloramphenicol and gentamicin to inhibit the bacterial contamination. Cycloheximide is incorporated to inhibit the rapidly growing saprobic fungi which could overgrow the slow growing primary pathogens. Okay. However, this antibiotic cycloheximide is also known to inhibit the growth of certain pathogenic species, or I should say opportunistic fungi like Aspergillus fumigatus and Talaromyces marnafi. So whenever we are suspecting these fungal infections, we do not add cycloheximide to Sabrot's dextrose agar. Now the next media which is used is corn meal agar, which is usually a nutritionally deficient medium. We use corn meal agar to demonstrate spore production in a fungi. We demonstrate certain spores which are called as chlamydospores, which is usually seen in Candida albicans. And then potato dextrose agar is usually employed to increase the sporulation, especially in the molds. Even if you don't have any other media, if you just grow the fungi on cut potato pieces, you will see that these molds sporulate very rapidly in the potato dextrose agar. So then we use another medium which is called as brain heart infusion agar, especially when we culture the sterile samples or tissue samples, and especially when we need to isolate dimorphic fungi, we usually employ the brain heart infusion agar. Apart from this, there are some special medium like dermatophyte medium for dermatophytes and Zapex dox agar for Aspergillus species. Okay, now for yeast, for Candida species, we employ what is called as the chrome agar. Now what you see in this picture are the different species of Candida which are grown on chrome agar. Okay, this particular picture is has been taken from our lab itself. Our own technicians and one of our PGs have actually done this beautiful artwork. You can see different types of Candida species producing different colors. Okay, depending on the ability of the species to metabolize the substrates which are present in the media, each of which gives rise to a different color. So what you see here, this light green colonies are caused by Candida albicans. The blue color is caused by the colonies are belonging to those of Candida tropicalis. Okay, the moist pink colonies belong to Candida glabrata, and the dry pink colonies belong to a species of Candida called Candida krusei. Okay, and this is nothing but a mold contaminant. Okay, luckily, I mean, this one is a mold contaminant, and these cream colored colonies belong to Candida parapsilosis. So different types of Candida species can be rapidly identified on this chrome agar media, which characteristically produce different colors depending on the different species of the Candida. Okay, now usually whenever we culture the fungi, we culture it for a period of 1 month. Okay, the reason is because there are some fungi which grow within 5 days. They are called as rapid growers. Some fungi grow within 1 to 2 weeks, which are called as moderate growers, and there are some fungi which grow by 3 to 4 weeks. They are called as slow growers. So usually most of your yeasts are rapid growers, and your zygomycetes and Aspergillus and Talaromyces species, all these are rapid growers. Most of your Demeticious fungi, that is group of fungi which are having a dark hyphae, they usually grow within 1 to 2 weeks. So that is your those fungi which are having dark hyphae, Okay, they grow within 1 to 2 weeks. And then there are some dimorphic fungi and certain other fungal species like Cladophila, Fonsaceae, etc., which causes chromoblastomycosis. They also grow in the 3 to 4 weeks. So one thing you have to remember is usually Cryptococcus grow within 1 week. Okay, then there are certain special agar like bird seed agar or Niger seed agar usually employed to culture the Cryptococcus. But in those suspected cryptococcal meningitis patients who have already been on treatment, it takes a little longer time. So for those people, it usually it grows by 3 to 4 weeks. So therefore, we need to whenever we get a suspected case of cryptococcal meningitis or any patient whom we are suspecting cryptococcus, especially from the CSF samples, we usually incubate for a period of up to more than 1 month. We incubate even up to 3 to 4 months at a stretch, so that we do not miss these isolates. So it is always important for the clinician to actually um, you know write the requisition form with proper labeling and also suspected diagnosis, so that we can specifically create conditions and we can culture the organisms in that specific manner. Okay, so then we have the serological test. As I told you, usually we detect antibodies or antigens against galactomannan and 1,3 beta D glucan. Okay, these are the two tests which are usually employed: galactomannan, 1,3 beta D glucan, and the one serological test which is also employed along with these two tests is your lateral flow assay. Okay, lateral probe assay for your Cryptococcus neoformans. Okay, so this particular test, the Cryptococcus neoformans, the lateral flow assay test, is highly specific for Cryptococcus, and it is in fact the best serological test available for fungal infections. Now, the advantage of these serological tests is that you can rule out lab. First is they are very rapid. Okay, it is very fast. You can easily do it. It is usually employed as a prognostic marker. Okay, and once a serological test is positive, we can easily interpret the clinical significance of positive cultures. So in other words, we can rule out lab contamination, and we can identify new isolate when the antibody is demonstrated against that particular antigen. So that is the major advantage of serological test. In fact, certain tests like your 1,3 beta D glucan test has been used as a prognostic tool to determine the outcome of invasive fungal infections, especially for Pneumocystis jirovecii, for invasive aspergillosis, and for invasive candidiasis. There is an organization called as EORTC, that is European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer and Mycosis Study, consensus. So this particular organization, the latest 2019 guidelines of this organization has included 1,3 beta D glucan assay in the diagnosis of invasive fungal infections caused by aspergillus and candida. Okay, and some of these serological tests like your galactomannan assay have got several disadvantages also, just like it has got advantages. And usually the main disadvantage is that the kits are expensive, so continuous treatment monitoring becomes very difficult, and it's very difficult to distinguish between superficial colonization and deep infection just based on the presence of antibodies. Sometimes antibodies are not detected in the early stage of disease or in immunosuppression, and we usually prefer antigen detection in such situations. And then sometimes we detect the no the microbial antigens usually require a large microbial burden. Detection of these antigens require a large microbial burden, so this affects the sensitivity of the test. And very importantly, because of the shared antigenicity of several genera and species of different pathogenic fungi, there will be cross reactions which are usually seen in these serological tests. So those are the disadvantages of serological test. But nonetheless, uh, one the serological tests are a very important prognostic tool, at least, and at least they can help you to rule out the lab contamination, especially for aspergillus. Then we also employ molecular methods, and definitely molecular diagnostic methods have again come up in a big way for the diagnosis of fungal infections. And because of these molecular methods available, there have been changes in the names of the fungi like penicillium to Talaromyces, etc. And also there have been reclassification or changes in the nomenclature of the different class of fungi. So that's why I spoke about zygomycete now being called as glomeromycetes. Okay, so that is because of these molecular methods, and several more changes are likely expected in future. Let's just wait and watch. So this is one test which I would like to highlight because usually we detect yeast with Candida chrome agar, and we also go with certain other tests like we utilize the uh, group of tests which are called as fermentation tests, sugar fermentation test and sugar assimilation test, etc., to conventionally detect the yeast. But nowadays we have this new technology which is greatly simplified the detection of yeast. It is called as the MALDI-TOF MS, which is full form is matrix assisted laser desorption ionization time of flight mass spectrophotometry. Don't worry, I'll simplify it for you. Basic principle of this assay is that this particular test will detect the is based on the ability of an electric or a magnetic field to deflect a flow of ions, each having a mass and a charge proportional to their trajectory. So the ions with a definite mass and charge, okay, uh, and the ability of these ions to be deflected with the help of the electric and magnetic field. So this is the basic principle. Now overall there are three steps in this particular method. You have the ionization chamber which produces the ions in the gas phase. Okay, so this is your ionization chamber which produce the ions in the gas phase. And then you have the analyzer which selects the ions by mass to charge ratio. So this is the ionizer which selects the ions. And then you have the detector that converts the ions uh, from the ionic current to the electric current. Okay, so this is your converter which converts the ionic current to your electric current. So what actually happens is that if you look at it closely, you have a laser beam. So once this laser beam hits the chamber, it's the sample, the specimen which is present in this target chamber. Okay, so this colony is present in this target. The laser beam hits this your chamber, ionization chamber. It will generate ions. Okay, now these ions will get converted into the electric fields. And this electric field is directed to the analyzer. In this analyzer, there is a separation taking place of all these ions according to time of flight. That's why it is called MALDI-TOF, time of flight. Based on the time movement of these ions, based on their mass and the charge ratio, the analyzer will separate it, and the smaller molecules will hit the detector. This is your detector. The smaller molecules with the smaller ions uh, de- will will hit the detector first, followed by the bigger ions, and these ions having similar charge to mass ratio, mass to charge ratio, these ions will be separated by a electrostatic mirror, and this detector converts this current, okay, into an amplified format. Okay, this electric current is now amplified, and a spectrum is generated. So based on this spectrum we can identify the different fungi. Okay, now apart from fungi, MALDI-TOF is also used in several other detection of several other bacterial species, but among the fungi mostly MALDI-TOF is proved very effective to detect the yeast. We can also detect the molds with the MALDI-TOF assay. Okay, this is just for your understanding that I have kept this. So you should be aware of a new technique called as a MALDI-TOF assay. So this completes the introduction to mycology. Thank you for your patient listening.